Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. I am excited to go ahead and continue our Sabbath productions, as it were. I'm really happy to finally have gotten onto YouTube. We were on Zoom just as a congregation privately by ourselves for a number of years, and Father put it on my heart to bring this forward. So I am excited and not excited about the fact that we've come into wintertime. I'm going to go ahead and go with a nice, pretty picture instead of being outside in the snow at this point in time. But with the winter season, we come into the season in the cycle of death. And I will remind you that death is not what people think it means. And of course, we as American Christians have a very biased view of death with our Western social democratic attitude towards things instead of the Eastern mystic attitude towards things. And so we look at death as an expiration and the finality of something, when actually it is more like everything that happens in between the beginning and the end. And so from an ancient Hebrew perspective, we are obviously looking at the hyphen in between the two dates on the tombstone, but it's much more than that. At any rate, that actually has nothing to do with what I'm going to teach about today, but I just wanted to say that I am noticing my attitude and my demeanor changing since the weather has changed. And I would encourage you to not follow suit. I would encourage you to still have your joy and excitement. I know it's starting to get cold, etc. Okay, so this week's Torah portion is actually Vayishlach. And that means, and he sent away. Now, I can tell you that there's a lot we could go into about that. But instead, what we need to talk about is the rest of the parasha. So he does separate out the wives according to the concubines, and then Leah, and then Rachel. And he sets everything up in such a way so that if the first group gets attacked, the rest of the group knows to flee. There's a lot of opinions about that, but the point is he does it. But he's doing this because of something very important, and that's what we need to talk about today. This specific message seems to be coming on the cusp of my own heart and feelings about certain people in my life, people within my circle of influence, but also comes from the perspective of what this Torah portion is actually about. People don't realize it, but this Torah portion, almost in its entirety, is about Esau, okay? So let's talk a minute about Esau. What do we know about him? Well, there's three important points that we can come up with concerning Esau. The first one is that obviously he was contrary to Jacob's process. What do I mean by that? I mean that even in the womb, they were striving with each other. They were wrestling with each other. And when we get into the prophecy that the older shall serve the younger, we start to see this perspective playing out, that Jacob would be the man of authority. Jacob would be in the position of authority. Jacob would be the sovereign. Now, there's a couple things that are important about that. The first one is that as the sovereign, everyone else around him would bow. Okay? Everyone around him would bow. The second, and this is the lesser important one, is that that meant that there was going to be a reaction by society to a change in tradition. Now, that's not really all that important, but a short and small thing is that when you go against the grain of the social flow, you are labeled. The reason I bring this up is because basically the tradition and the understanding is whoever was born first got the double portion inheritance and inherited the family business, inherited the responsibility and the legacy of the clan. But we know that if the older was going to serve the younger, that Jacob was going to become the clan leader. So before there was ever any blessings, any deception, any whatever you want to call it, there was there was a dimension of a predetermined life for Jacob, that he would be king. So all that does is let you know that as a result of that, he's going to have a difficult time. And that difficult time is basically going to come in the form of jealousy and of violence, of threats of violence, etc. Esau says, when my father is dead, or when I am done mourning my father, I will kill my brother. Okay. Okay. So when we look at this, we need to understand that there is a difference and there's a contrast in Torah, the Torah puts here, that a lot of people don't realize, but we're going to go ahead and get into it. So let me start at the beginning and say that I am trained in a martial art discipline that is, it's actually very brutal. It is designed to destroy the person who's attacking you. Very similar to some of the other arts that are combat arts and not competition arts. And I can tell you that one of the things that we learn in our whole thing is who our enemy is. This was deep for me because I learned it first in martial arts, which when I tell you this, okay, so let me explain to you. When I first met with my teacher, who is called a guru in this art, that's the word that's used, but it means teacher. He told me, he said, there's two things you need to know right off the bat. He said, the first one is, I am not going to teach you martial arts. I'm going to remind you of what you already know. That's not quite as relevant with this discussion. It's somewhat relevant. And then the second was, and the only person you're ever going to fight is yourself. And so what I concluded is that God gave me the most brutal art he could possibly give me to fight myself. He gave me the tool. Well, I will say this, in the process of learning, I excelled. And what I mean by that is that a movement that is designed to last 4 months, I learned in a very short amount of time. In fact, there's 18 movements that are the basic movements of the art that you're supposed to learn one every 4 months. I learned the entire set in 4 months. So I excelled at it. I got very good at it. But in that process, I learned a few things about myself, and I learned a few things about other people. But there's a tenet. There's 5 tenets in the art. I'm not going to go through all 5, but they basically have to do with the philosophy that equates into the actual physical movements, the philosophy that equates into the actual understanding of engagement and that type of thing. So let me explain how it works. First and foremost is that because it's so brutal, you default to not using it. Okay, that's a key, and that's important because whoever you use it on will be damaged for life. It's bone breaking, joint tearing, ruining the anatomy of a human to cause them to no longer have the ability to attack you. Okay. But one of the amazing things in it is the third tenet. I believe it is. Yes, this is the third tenet. Know your enemy. And it's interesting because as soon as I say that, as soon as I mention that to a student when I'm teaching them this art, they're like, yeah, you got to be ready for them. You got to know who you're fighting. Well, the truth is you need to know your enemy because there's no such thing as an enemy. Now, remember, this is a Indonesian art that came out of the jungle. This is not some biblical philosophy, right? But what's amazing is as I began to encounter the ancient pictographic Hebrew, and I began to encounter the ancient nomadic lifestyle, I was blown away by the fact that it's absolutely present in Hebrew understanding. Know your enemy. So let's start at the beginning. In my art, there are no enemies. The reason there are no enemies is because that's a mindset. That's a mentality. How you think about another human being. Okay? But instead, what you have is an opponent, somebody who opposes you. Why is that important? It's important because in the process of opposition, you have to offer offensive and defensive technique to the opponent. But it keeps in mind that it's not an enemy, it's another human being. Now, there's a few reasons why this is significant, but a lot of people don't realize that the only enemy that you will ever fight is yourself. But what's interesting is that we see in Scripture, we see in Psalms, we see in all of the different parashas and some other things where the word enemy is used, and we're going to take a look at that. But please understand that from your perspective, as a Hebrew, who's a Hebrew, one who is crossed over from what? From the realm of death into the realm of life. Meaning they've gone from existing to living. They've gone from surviving to becoming. They've gone from being reactive to being proactive. They've gone from having an internal or an external locus of control to an internal locus of control. They have gone from what? From life happening to them instead of life happening for them instead of life happening to them. They have gone from needing external validation to prove that they are important, that they're significant, that they can do it, that they have what it takes, to understanding that they have what it takes, to knowing that they are significant, that they are a high maintenance child of God. That's a Hebrew. That's what Abraham realized. And see, that's the part, one of the things that I regret about the canon of Scripture is that there was such an anti-Semitic sentiment at the time of the compendium of the Bible that the Midrash Rabbah was not allowed in. The other stories, the other Jewish folklore was not allowed in. So we never get to know about Abraham in his city and what he went through to become who he was at 75 years old when he enters the promised land. That's important. And it needs to be understood that Abraham had to learn about his God. The reason why it's so important to know that the only enemy you ever fight is yourself is because there is a philosophy that comes from that thought process, and that is that everybody is important. Remember, you can violate the Torah for the preservation of life. The principle is that there is a overarching sentiment of caring for someone else before destroying someone else. It's interesting, when I was actually training in this art, I actually was part of the training is to learn anatomy, to learn how joints work, and learn their limitations, to learn how muscles are connected, how tissue is connected, because you're going to tear tissue, you're going to dislocate joints. But in that process, I learned who the human being is. I learned that every single human being has the same muscular structure, the same skeletal structure, the same nerves, the same blood vessels, etc. Which means that I don't need to come up with some special customized way of dealing with each individual. As an opponent comes to me, I'm able to engage them the same, because why? They're the same as me. I know what my limitations are. But what's interesting is that there is one other part of this thing that is important when it comes to this philosophy. We'll get to it in a minute, because I really want to emphasize that we're dealing with a human being. When you are engaging in combat, you are dealing with another human being. If it hurts you, it will hurt them. And if it injures you for life, it will injure them for life. If it emotionally affects you, it probably affects them. Now, I can tell you, people go to great lengths to restructure their reality and disassociate from the more vulnerable ways of existing. In other words, somebody can totally disassociate themselves from having a conscience towards hurting another individual. That's real. But the simplicity is that principle of what's left in the human after that. Let me explain what I mean. When I engage somebody, I also understand the level at which I have to effectively disarm and immobilize. That's all you're allowed to do legally in the United States when it comes to self-defense. Anything outside of that is, of course, assault, etc. And so as a result of that, there's an understanding that needs to be had that we're going to take away the weapon and we're going to stop them from being able to chase us, and that's it. But you have no idea the level of damage that can occur in those moments. The principle is that when you have an empathy or an understanding of your opponent, then you have a better way of getting a grasp on the understanding. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if you understand what it is that you are about to do, you have a better grasp of not falling into a darkness. I want you to think about Joshua. Joshua is an amazing human being, studied under Moshe. In fact, a lot of the times when Moshe was writing the Torah, which means he was receiving the Torah from Yahweh, Joshua was present in the tent of meeting with him. And furthermore, there's an element where it seems as though Joshua was learning the wisdom and the depths of understanding of Torah. For example, when Moses comes down the mountain with his face glowing and covers himself with a veil, Joshua still goes into the tent of meeting with him. And so, or maybe it's when Moses came out of the tent of meeting, I can't remember which. But the point being is that Joshua was with him the whole time. Joshua is the one who leads the army against the attack of the Amalekites when the Israelites first come out of the Red Sea. Joshua is the one who leads the conquest into Canaan and actually does and completes the commandment to take the land. But make no mistake, Joshua was a killer. Joshua was very, very effective military strategist, but he was also an elite guerrilla warfare trained individual. He didn't only know how to run a sling, how to run arrows, and how to use a spear and to use a shield. He knew and understood Plan X, and he knew and he understood wedged attacks, All of those things that you would learn at West Point, he knew, but he also was a Navy SEAL, which means he had to get up close and personal and do damage. Now, how does a human being function within the confines of the damage that needs to be done and still be the righteousness of God? He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Joshua knew this. Joshua had that understanding. He was in the sentiment of the covenant that we now call the new covenant. Joshua understood his identity as a high maintenance child of God, and he had empathy for people. Proof is in the fact of when the Gedalites manipulate him. The Gedalites come along and they say, oh, we come from a distant land. Look, our bread is moldy and our clothes are torn. We were just wondering if when your expansion occurs that you would just give us peace. And of course, he says, I will give you peace, because he figures he's not going to be there for a long time, right? Well, they just happen to be the neighbors. And so, of course, after that, he says, okay, fine. Since you guys want peace, you'll have peace. But you also are going to be the carriers of water and the hewers of wood. The important thing to understand about Joshua's process is that when he needed to do what he needed to do, he did it because it had a purpose involved. What I mean by that, I mean that rule number one in my art is walk away. And the principle is not that you turn your back and walk away from your opponent. That could get you killed. But you step back far enough that they're not able to strike you, and you try to engage them in verbal de-escalation. Why? Because of the damage you can do. And that's the key here, because of the damage that can be done. Now, one of the reasons why this is so important is because when we study the structure of an enemy, which we're going to do, we need to understand when to engage. The reason for that is because the second tenet of my art is once you're engaged, you're fully engaged. You make some assumptions about your opponent, but the biggest one you make is that you have to win, because you don't know what they have. You don't know what they're capable of. You don't know how much better or stronger or faster they are. You assume all that. You assume they're bigger. You assume they're better. You assume they're stronger, younger, a better fighter, has a weapon and friends. You assume all of that. That second tenet basically gets you in a position of understanding that once it's happening, you have to be decisive. You have the empathy. You know your enemy. That's the truth. But what's so very important is once they have demonstrated that they're an opponent, you don't get to go easy on them. You can't afford it, because you don't know what they can do. So you hit them hard and fast. And I'm not talking about punch. I'm talking about ending the conflict. Well, there's three ways in which this can play out. The first one is to understand that when I'm talking about another human being who has the same emotional attachments as you, who has the same life problems as you, who has the same coping mechanisms as you, because guys, you don't realize this, but there's probably only about 7 coping mechanisms. And the truth is you probably practice about 4 of them, okay? Whether it be a stimulant, a destimulant, a disassociation, whether it be a comforting of self, or whether it be a hardening of heart. They do it too. Why is this so important? Because you need to understand what you're about to do before you do it. That's going to become relevant here, and it's going to play a big role in how you deal with humans from this day forward. It's interesting when you're studying war, combat. I mean, my guru made me study a lot of different things about war and combat. Mayamato Musashi, Sun Tzu, people like that, basically the great warriors and writers of ancient history who did mighty exploits, as it were, but be the receiving side of that. Okay, so you guys are probably like, oh my gosh, this dude is just going all warrior on us. You're right, I am, but not why you think. I'm not here to try to convince you that you are a warrior or that you need to be in combat or that we're having some sort of huge spiritual war in which we're battling the dragon and all that kind of stuff. This is actually about the other person. And in that process, I think there's some really important things that we need to understand. There are some words that we are going to learn today. We're going to learn about hate. We're going to learn about enemies. And we're going to understand the difference between what Yeshua said and how people interpret it versus what is said in Torah. And is there a contradiction or is there a conflict with those things? There's a few reasons why we need to study this out, but one of the biggest is because this parasha, this current area of scripture that we're studying, something happens to Jacob. And it's intriguing because I would have you think about Jacob differently than what you do. So let me explain something. Part of the Hebrew lifestyle is combat. You need to understand that in the ancient nomadic philosophy, every person over the age of 20 was a man of war. And I'm not talking about grunts. I'm not talking about people who would go stand in front of an army and take a bullet because they were the first ones on the line. Every single last Hebrew was a guerrilla warrior. Every single last Hebrew from Noah until Abraham, until Jacob, were elite fighters. They were trained in combat. There is a story in this parasha that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because we join the story during the action. And of course, you guys know this is the parasha in which Jacob wrestles God. But you need to realize how that's playing out. We don't know how it started, but we do know the philosophy. We know walk away, played a role. We can find that in scripture. We can find the passive de-escalation that Hebrews sought first. We can find in scripture that once there was an engagement, they did not fight as if they were going to lose, and they definitely did not worry about who they were fighting. Once you're engaged, you're fully engaged, and you make all of those assumptions about your opponent. The reason why this is so important is because when Jacob engaged who he was wrestling, he engaged him fully with the intention to do exactly what had happened to him, which was a dislocation. It's interesting because I can look at that little story and analyze the combat. And I can analyze all of the things that are involved in it. But what I can also do is understand that once Jacob was engaged with that opponent, it was not because they were playing. So why did he engage him? Was it his enemy? We don't know. What we do know is that when he engaged him, he didn't engage him with the intention that he was going to lose. And it seems as though he was prevailing. And then there's a point in time where there's a dislocation, and then that ends it. And of course, in real life, if you've ever had a dislocation, it will end. It will end. It is very, very difficult to operate in combat with a dislocation. So the reason why this is so important is because there is a declaration that was in the previous parashas that caused Jacob to leave Beersheba. And as he goes out from Beersheba, the first thing he does is encounter what? Jacob's ladder, right? And then after that, there is the principle that he is now going to be in relationship with God up until this moment. We don't know why the engagement occurred. But we know that if Jacob was prevailing, he was going all out. He was trying to finish the fight. And until the dislocation, he did not finish. He did not stop. He did not cease. He was engaging this opponent. But was he engaging an enemy? I will prove to you that he was not. But he was definitely engaging an opponent. Was Joshua engaging an enemy? I will prove to you that he was. I will also prove to you that David engaged enemies, not opponents. You say, well, that's very confusing. I know, because I just told you that there is no enemies. I will explain. There is a sentiment in Christianity at large that discusses the idea that there is an equal and opposite power moving against the people of God and opposing God. Okay, so let's say that we take the intensification of all power in the universe, who obviously there's nobody who could best that, because if it could, then it would not be the intensification of all power in the universe. Whether it be spirit or energy, or however we discuss the existence of this creative being, we know that there is no opponent of him. However, there is a declaration that there are enemies of him. So we're going to go ahead and start to engage this a little bit. But the short version of this is I told you, no person who you fight is your enemy. And no person who you engage is not absolved. No person whom you engage is reduced in value because you are engaging them. So for those of you who are in the military who go on the front line and have to fire at an enemy and deal with them, you understand that they are still human beings. That's the most important thing here. Does it change what's about to happen? No. If you engage me after I have tried to de-escalate, I am going to make your body not work the way it worked before. And that's just a matter of philosophy, technique, and that's it. It doesn't matter how strong you are. It doesn't matter what you're capable of. As long as I can execute my technique correctly, you will not be able to use your body the way it worked before. That's something you need to understand, that once you engage somebody, there will be change. And once you engage somebody, they will never be the same. You will walk away the same, in a sense. Because once you've engaged somebody, you change as well. You need to be aware of these things going into a situation in which you have an opponent. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to actually look up a combination of words, and we'll go ahead and we'll document them on the whiteboard as we go. But let's start here. So the first thing that we need to discuss. Okay, let's do it this way. So what we're going to do is we're just going to, I'm going to go ahead and change this over to the King James because the Strong's Concordance is concorded to the King James, but the search function for those words as how they would be used in the King James, therefore the Strong's, you have to search in the King James. So let's go with enemies. And hate. Okay. And then we will go into Psalms. And we are looking for this one right here, Psalm 139. I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. So let's talk about who does David hate? Do I not hate them, Yahweh, that hate thee? Am I not, or am not I grieved with those who rise up against thee? Okay. So let's take a look at this. How precious are thy thoughts also, or how precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. Let's go ahead and change this over to NLT for just a moment. Make it a little bit more readable. I prefer the NLT when it comes to actual reading. I just don't like it necessarily in some cases. Okay, so we will go and start in 17. So this is going to be Psalm 139, 17. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God? They cannot be numbered. I can't even count them. They outnumber the grains of sand. And when I wake up, you are still with me. O God, if only you would destroy the wicked. Get out of my life, you murderers. They blaspheme you. Your enemies misuse your name. O Yahweh, shouldn't I hate those who hate you? Shouldn't I despise those who oppose you? Yes, I hate them with total hatred, for your enemies are my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life. So we are going to concentrate very specifically on verse 22, but let me talk to you for a second about it. What does Yeshua say? Yeshua says, pray for your enemies, right? Be kind to them, right? Give your enemy drink when he is thirsty, right? Paul says, if it be at all possible, be at peace with all men. Okay? So let me explain something to you. I don't walk around with the sentiment that I want to fight. In fact, when my anger starts to rise, I become afraid of what I know. That's legitimate. I believe that there is an element of that being the part that I need to combat, that being the part that I need to fight. I don't consider myself a tough guy. I don't consider myself to be a badass. I consider myself to understand anatomy, technique, and philosophy. And a combination of those three things will destroy you. We need to understand that it takes a lot of human to not engage in a conflict. I'm going to tell you why. One of the things my guru talked to me about He said, look, he said, obviously, as you have become advanced in this art, you are destructive. He said, but what you need to understand is that you now have become superior to every other art. We studied other arts to create counters. There are not just counters built into the art. You have to study the art and study another art and create your own counters. So a kick from Taekwondo, a punch from Kempo, all have counters that I have created based upon my study of the art and my understanding of my art. Why was that so important? Is because what he was saying was, since you are superior and everybody's inferior, you will always be hurting somebody who can't protect themselves from you. Oh, that was deep. My gosh, there was this moment when I was like, so what you're saying is that no matter what, I'm the bully, right? No matter what, I am the problem. Man, it was heavy. There was that moment. Because the truth is that once you become higher in knowledge, in understanding, whether that be in the areas that I mentioned that a Hebrew is. Listen, if you're the head and not the tail, that means there's tails. And you need to remember that. You need to get your mind wrapped around the level of power you have if you're the head, and power they don't have because they're the tail. My superior understanding of the body, my superior understanding of joints and bones and structures means that I have what? The responsibility to protect the opponent. So when do we shift gears? Well, that's the part that's important. There's a point in time where a decision needs to be made about the engagement. And at that time of engagement, then there's that moment where superiority becomes the necessity. And that engagement then becomes a full engagement. It doesn't matter how strong or weak the person is, how trained or untrained they are. They engaged. Now it's time to destroy. That's the principle. So you can understand how Joshua could function as a human being, how he could sleep at night, although he was a conquestor. It wasn't, he didn't sleep at night because he had his fill of indulgences and collapsed in exhaustion. He slept at night because he had shalom. His conscience was clear. And that's the key here. Because one of the things you're going to find is that as you engage, and when I explain to you whom you're going to engage, that part is going to become important as well. And I'm going to explain what engagement is. But as you engage, you are going to be accused. You are going to be told that you're not good enough. You're going to be told that you should not be the elite one, that you shouldn't be the superior one. Okay? Okay. So we're going to jump into these words. But before we do, I want you to understand that when Yeshua says to give food and drink to an enemy, he's talking about the law of hospitality that overrides every other rule of engagement. If your enemy comes to your door and needs water and food, you feed them and send them out again and let them regroup, and then you go out to the field and kill them. Yeshua said, pray for your enemies. Why? Because they are an opponent. And just as much as you hurt and have wounds and have coping mechanisms, that's how much you need to understand about them. Once engagement occurs, that's a different story. course he's going to say, pray for those. Because why? Because we want them to come. The truth is that any enemy whom I have, oh, wait a minute. Q, you said you don't have any enemies. Any enemy that I have, my greatest desire for them is to learn my art, learn my philosophy, step into Torah, and become the change that this world needs. It can be difficult when your enemy becomes your friend and you have to let go of the things they've done because they now are on the side that you fight for. That's a journey. There's power there in that understanding. So let's get into this word study, which I know some of you guys don't like the word studies, but there is a purpose behind them. Going into the interlinear on the Blue Letter Bible app for Psalm 139, verse 22, we are looking for the word enemy. It is pronounced oyev.
Strong's H 341. Ayav. Ayav.
Okay. Now, that is the word for enemy. And it comes from the root, ayav. And it is to be hostile to be an enemy to. Look at this. It is used only one time in Scripture as a verb. So you're going to enemy somebody, okay? I want you to see where this is at. This is in Exodus chapter 23, verse 22. Be careful to obey him. Follow all my instructions, and then I will be an enemy to your enemies. I will oppose those who oppose you. Let's take a look at what this says in the Hebrew. And we'll talk about who him is in a moment, but be careful to obey him, right? And then I will what? Be an enemy to your enemies. There's our word being used there, being an enemy. So enemying yourself to something. Remember, when we're talking about enemy in the English language, it's a noun, right? But in the Hebrew, it is a verb, okay? All right. And then I will oppose those who oppose you. I will be an adversary. That's going to be the word sur, which is the same word for rock or siege. But the principle is that I will be a fortress against your enemies who are a fortress against you. Okay, so getting back to Psalm 139, going back into our word enemy, we are going to go ahead and study this out. But right off the bat, you can see that this is a child root. I will explain. Okay, so we have an aleph. We have a yod. And we have a bet. Okay? And that, of course, is what we call a weak verb, but also you need to understand that it is going to be anything that has a yod, anything that has a hey, anything that has a vav, anything that has an aleph in it, anything that has a doubled last letter is what we call a child root, which means we can trace the parent root by what? By eliminating the one of those letters. And you say, why wouldn't you eliminate the aleph? I just know this root, and so I know that the yod goes away. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is we will go into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. So I'm just going to copy and paste the Strong's number into when it loads. Okay, that's not loading right now. We'll call that technical difficulties. And we will work on getting that pulled up. Let me bring something up real quick on this. For those of you who are seasoned, already know what these two letters are. You already know what I'm about to get into here. But what's interesting about it is that we have the lead ox, right? Let's fix that a little bit here. There we go. There's the lead ox. And we have the bait, which is the drawing of the tent, right? And so interestingly enough, we have strong here, right? And we have tent. We'll get into this some more, but basically that's going to be kind of our thought process on this. Now, it's very possible that it is actually the yod, okay? But that's one of the reasons why I was trying to cut and paste this here. And let me go ahead and restart that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so at any rate, getting into our digital lexicon, ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, and removing the H. Okay. And let me pull this up now and see how it's mentioned here. The idea is to attack, to be antagonistic or unfriendly to another, an action taken by an enemy. Okay, so it's not necessarily the enemy itself, it's the action of the enemy, but that they do a very specific thing. But we're looking at the parent root here. And of course, it is actually the first parent root in the lexicon. Okay, and it means, it's concrete, means pull. Why? Because it's the strength of the tent, right? The action is to stand, and the abstract is enemy. Okay, so now when we're happening here, okay, so now when we're looking at this, the support of the tent or house, right? And then so of course we have father. We have father as the parent root, a man begotten who has a child, the provider and support to the household, the ancestor of the family line, the patron of a profession or art. Okay. When we start to look at these other things, and we see, for example, Ya'av is the firm standing of the tent pole. Ya'av, a wish, a standing firm for what is desired. Okay. Then we have Uv, which is a leather bag that holds wine and is hung from a pole of the tent. It can also mean medium as one who evokes dead the dead, a ghost, or possibly from their mumbling like a sound of wine poured out of a wineskin. Okay, then we come to our word here, okay? The tent pole is pointed at one end and doubles as a spear, which can be used against an enemy to defend, also a support of the family. So let's talk a minute about pictographs. Remember, our pictographs sometimes give a solution to the problem. For example, remember our ancient Hebrew pictographic representation of unclean is actually the drawing of a container and water, as in the solution to being unclean. The solution to having dirt on you is to wash, and therefore how to become clean is to wash. Therefore, the solution is the pictograph. Well, that's no different in this case, where we have the father who protects the clan, but also that the center pole of the tent can be used as a spear, pointed on one end so that it can be driven into the ground, but can be easily removed and used as a weapon. Of course, at that point in time, the tent is no longer functional, but part of the tent becomes a weapon. So what are we learning from this idea? An enemy is not an enemy in ancient Hebrew thought because you think they're an enemy. Oh, this is going to be important. An enemy is an enemy because you have to defend yourself against them. What does that mean? That means that you yourself don't have enemies, but they declare themselves to be one. You see, this is where we get into the destroyer part. You got to understand, an enemy is somebody who opposes you. An enemy is somebody who wants to destroy you. An enemy is somebody who wants to take your property or your life or the lives of your family or their property. But what you need to understand is you don't yourself identify yourself as that person's enemy. They're identifying themselves as an enemy who needs the tent pole stuck through them or who needs the Father put through them. Okay? Now that sounds kind of crazy because when we finally get into it, the Father is definitely the protector, but now we see him on the offensive. We see this strength of the tent on the offensive. Meaning what? He's not that provision, protection, and instruction to that other individual. In fact, we could probably come up with 3 things that he is to that other individual, right? One of which would probably be the destroyer. Which brings us to what? To the word Yasha, right? Yod, Shin, Ayin, destroyer watches, which is the root word of the name Yeshua. Remember, Yeshua's name means to establish the destroyer who watches. Literally, salvation is the snatching away violently from danger. In other words, you are going to destroy whatever it is that is causing the danger to your family and to your property. Property played a role. We see a defense of property in the ancient Hebrew lifestyle. We see the decisiveness of a leader knowing when to let the property go and when to defend it. And so from that point of view, then we understand that the idea here is that a person engaging you does not necessarily equate to your enemy. That's important because there's some people who are just going to be absolute idiots who need a thumping. And I may not mean physical. Maybe they need a philosophical thumping. Maybe they need a verbal thumping. Maybe your version of de-escalation is helping them understand that it would be a really bad idea to engage you physically. My point is that not everybody is an enemy, but there are enemies. I'm going to get to that in a minute. So now, when we are engaging, we understand that there's a difference between an opponent and an enemy. We understand that the true enemy is yourself. Because who wants to destroy you more than your self-loathing? When you are at your lowest point of self-esteem and your lowest point of believing in you and finding yourself unlovable, do you understand the level of destruction that you're capable of that begins with you? Whether it be your substance abuse, whether it be your coping mechanisms, your disassociation, your personality disorders, your limiting beliefs, your wounds and your entitlements, and your lack of imagination. Do you know that one of the things that we actually teach in our martial art is that the only limitation you have is your anatomy and a lack of imagination? Sure, there are actual movements that are designed to engage the enemy most effectively depending on how they are attacking. But the principle remains that if your arm doesn't bend that way, you probably can't move that way, and therefore that would not be an effective move. And you need to think of how to move in order to be effective. In other words, yeah, we have what we call strict movements that are actual movements that train you on how to engage. But then the rest is you need to imagine how to engage based upon the limitations that your opponent has and that you have. So understand that opponents need to have the compassion that you are the superior and they are inferior. Those of you who have learned the truth about the pagan holidays that have infiltrated Christianity need to engage an opponent who believes that you are a heretic and out of order with empathy, with compassion and understanding. And you don't engage them as if they are your enemy. And I'm going to show you why. Because there's a deep philosophy here and a deep understanding. Okay, next level. We understand what an enemy is now. In the ancient Hebrew understanding, the word enemy doesn't mean enemy. It means the defender. Okay? So when the word enemy comes up, we understand that that's somebody who you've had to defend yourself against, who has intent to destroy. Listen, you end up in a situation where you end up in an argument with somebody, say, downtown talking to somebody and they get riled up and you now are engaged with them. That's an opponent. They didn't seek out your home, seek out your family, seek out your children, or seek out your property. And so you engage them very differently than you would somebody who you got to pull the stupid tent up out of the ground and stick. This is very important because there's a justification built into the name Yeshua that there is something that needs to be destroyed. So we'll get back to this, but what I would like to do next is investigate one of the other words that's being used here in the Hebrew that people don't really realize how important it actually is. So let's go to that next. So getting back into our verse, we have something else here, and that is this word, hating, hatred, to hate. You know, that word, unfortunately, does not translate well. But let's say that we go with it for a moment. And what we will encounter is a startling truth. The word hate has been manipulated by the American culture to equate to a justification for inequality. What do I mean by that? When you hear things like hate speech, or you hear things like hate crimes, that's not quite how hate works, okay? But if we really understood hate the way that it is in the Hebrew, you would understand that it is a very different word. So this is another time when you will have to change your thinking. The word hate that's being used here in this verse, where he says, I hate them with a perfect hatred. Who does he hate? The enemies of God. We're going to find out what the enemies of God are, and then we're going to find out what our responsibility is concerning the enemies of God. But now, as we go through this, in principle, we're going to have to go ahead and get into the ancient Hebrew. So our word, which is basically sin-ah, sin-ah. Let's see if I got it.
Strong's H 8135. Sin-ah. Sin-ah.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily like all of his pronunciations, but we get pretty close on it. Okay, so from the word sana, to be hateful or to hate. Well, that doesn't really help, right? This is kind of a circular argument. So let's get back into our ancient pictographic Hebrew. Go ahead and copy this one, jump back over here, and put this into our search. Of course, remove the H. You guys know the drill. Okay. So right off the bat, we've got sanat as the intense hostility and aversion, usually deriving from fear, anger, or a sense of injury, extreme dislike, or antipathy, which would be the opposite of empathy. Okay, let's go to our parent root, though. So our parent root is actually samach, or samech nun. Samech nun. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's put this stuff up on the board real quick. Start a new page. We'll go ahead and do our sheen. Okay. And then noon, and then aleph, right? And of course we know what? Well, here's our whole child root chart again. Yod, Hey, Vav, Aleph, doubled last letter equals a child root. Just a reminder, so we can drop the Aleph, okay? That leaves us with just the Sheen Nun, and that is our That is our actual parent root. Okay, that's our parent root. Okay, and then what we have to do is understand that this is the na. This original pronunciation was SH. So if we ever have it as an S, which we do in this case, we change it to samech. So now it's samech, and of course we'll go final noon so that it looks recognizable in the lexicon that we're using. So what we need to do now is we need to look at what these definitions are. So in this case, we are looking at the concrete word thorn, okay? And the action is to pierce, and the abstract is to hate, okay? But we have a pictographic definition here. So let's go ahead and read through the pictographic definition. Go ahead and get rid of that. Go. Pictographic definition. The pictograph samech is a picture of a thorn. The noon is a picture of a seed. Combined, these mean thorn seed. The thorn, the seed of a plant, which, or with small sharp points, causes one to turn directions to avoid them. Okay. So before we go any further, let's go ahead and document that. So we have the drawing of the seed. That's the thorn seed. And then, of course, we have the drawing of seed sprout. And on this side, we have a definition we don't know yet. And on this side, we have continue. Okay, which we'll get into. Okay, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go into the other book. We're going to have to go into the Ancient Hebrew Language and Alphabet book, and we're going to have to go look up Samek, which is way over here. Okay. And so we will by the way, it comes after the noon. Known as the scene in ancient languages, or in ancient Paleo Hebrew, or what we call Paleo's Proto-Sinaitic. But it is the mnemonic meaning is like a shield. Thorn bushes were used by shepherds to build a wall or shield made to enclose his flock during the night to protect them from predators. A flock is protected in the wall of thorns to pierce or to be sharp, right? But then we want to look at the definition in terms of the pictograph itself, which we'll find over here. So what's interesting about this, as I'm looking this up, is the idea that, okay, so it means to hold or to take hold. And I will explain in a minute what we're looking at or thinking about here. A thorn holds onto the skin or fur of animals. This letter can also mean to protect when a shepherd was in the wilderness overnight with the flock, he would construct a corral of thorn bushes to protect the flock from predators. Okay, so we understand this whole idea of building these shelters, these temporary shelters for the flocks, right? Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to jump over to the actual parent root pictographic definition here. And that is going to be basically the it's going to be the Samech Nun. And so when we're looking at this, you're going to find that sometimes the definition in the two different books is significant enough to look at. It may not necessarily be the case in this one, but I want to make sure that we cover all the bases. And of course, as you know, a lot of times we review this de novo. We pretend like we haven't looked it up before in order to gain a better understanding and have the humility that we may not know everything, right? And that's a key here. So we may not know everything. So as we move over to the Samech, I am anticipating that it's probably going to be the same thing, but we'll double check. There's enough of these that I will never actually memorize them per se. Okay, protective seed. See, that's interesting. It is actually something different, right? Okay, so let's chat about this a minute, okay? When you are walking through a field of grass after it has gone to seed and is now dying, you find when you get home these little sharp, pokey things in your socks. And those little sharp, pokey things in your sock drive you crazy, right? They drive you nuts until you get home and actually dig them out. And sometimes you just have to throw away the socks because you just can't get them out. This is how I want you to think about the cement. It is not necessarily about large thorns, but instead things that catch, okay? Even if we went with like a goat head, or like when you're walking and you get those goat heads in your shoes, or worse yet in your flip-flops, and they end up poking through. It's interesting. There's a reason why that occurs, is because the goat head actually has a piece of the seed that's designed to break off and stay lodged inside so that it can be carried further, but also that seed, that little piece will break off and become the seed for the new plant. Okay. Anyway, so the point is that a lot of times those will break off, and later on you'll find them in your shoes like months later. But that's how I want you to think about the samach, or the sin, is that it lodges itself inside and takes hold or grabs. Okay. Now, just for a moment, we're going to touch on something important that you need to be aware of. And that is let's see, what do I need here? Oh, I know what I need. Here, that's where I need to be. Oh my goodness. Driving me crazy. All right, there we go. That is that the Samech Nun, when you add a tet to it, has a very interesting fact behind it. Looks like I may have already passed it. Sna. Okay. The word that I'm looking for actually is the word Satan. And it is one of the adopted roots from Samech Noon. But at this point in time, I don't see it. Maybe because I'm not looking in the right place. Anyways, by adding the tet, which is the drawing of a basket, which has a round top to it, it literally says to cause to turn. And it is the Hebrew word Satan, which means to oppose, where we get the name or the title Satan in scripture. And so what's interesting is that Samech still has that thorn idea, but the idea is you're walking down a path, and as you're walking down the path, your leg catches on a thorn, and it causes you to turn off of the path to look away from the direction of the path you're going to see what caught on your leg. That is the idea of Satan. But anyways, it has that same root. I'm probably just not going far enough back into it, but I didn't want to get too much into that. I just wanted to point out that that's one of the things that comes up in that. So, having said that, let's get back to our board for just a moment. Okay, so remember I said that we didn't know what this definition was. Okay, but this one is to hold, right? To hold. And we know that this actually can mean protective thorn. Protective thorn. Okay, protective thorn. And the principle behind it was that it was designed, it was part of a bigger structure of thorns to house the flocks for the night. While the shepherd slept, he would put that protection around them, that hedge of protection, and then they would be safe from predators. So how do we get to hate? Right? What is the principle there? How do we get to hate? Let's get back into our tablet for just a moment and talk about this word hate. So off the bat, the first thing that you need to understand is that it is, as we're looking through this, you'll see that there's the Tzadi Nun, which has the pointed or piercing object. The Sin Nun, so the Tzadi Nun is actually a cognate. This is what we call a cognate. We don't need to get into that right now. Okay, but Samech Nun, Yod Nun is a sharp thorn that causes pain. Okay, now here we go. Physical or mental damage, the pain from the thorn. This is the osun. So adding the aleph to it now becomes what? Harm, physical or mental damage or injury. And then we've got sa'an, where the aleph transfers to the middle and becomes pierce, to pierce with a weapon. Oh, here we have something interesting going on. We have a coincidental definition connection between enemy and hate, right? Which is what? The piercing weapon. Here we go with sa'an or sa'in, which is a sharp weapon as a thorn. Then we have sana. Like a thorn, hate causes one to turn away from another. Okay. This is obviously a very different understanding than what we have in the English language for this HATE. When we think about the idea of a thorn catching your leg. So yeah, I don't know if everybody's been through this before, but I know that I've been on a hike before and I've gotten to a point where the trail was overgrown with thorn bushes and I was unable to proceed. I had to go around. So it causes you to deviate from the path. This is not just a simple thing where you're walking along and you get a burr. This is something that causes you to actually deviate from the path you're on and have to go around it or go through it in pain. You can push through those thorns. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to trim an unwieldy rose bush, but you always end up with blood drawn. It's just a matter of time. And so as a result of that, that's how I understand it, right? That there is going to be pain involved. But the key is that the word hate in the Hebrew, sanah, means something that causes you to turn away from a person. So now when we hear Yeshua say, you have heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. And he says, but I say, pray for your enemy, right? Be kind to those who despitefully use you, etc. We need to understand that there's no commandment to actually hate your enemy. So he was talking about a Talmudic reference. However, there is definitely precedent for there to be an aversive emotional attachment to certain individuals. Now, do we think that Joshua hated the people who he was killing? One of the things that we encounter if we actually read the folklore behind Abraham's encounter with God is the violence, the human sacrifice, the bloodlust of the city itself, but also a hearty approval for the torture, for the exploitation, and for the enslavement of humans, all for the sake of worshiping a God. Now, if you are one of those people who likes to call God Sky Daddy and rejects the notion of him because of the violence that has occurred in his name up until this point in time, I will remind you that it was humans who made that decision and not him. However, there is definitely a precedence for the eradication of a nation in Scripture as a result of a very specific practice, and that is human sacrifice, animal sacrifice in the sense of animal cruelty. I'll get to that in a minute. Exploitation of children, obviously, and also child sacrifice. Those four things played a role in the Canaanite lifestyle. And so as Joshua goes in and purges that, he sleeps at night, has shalom at night, is okay at night because of what he's removing. But when Yahweh tells the people through Moses, you're not going in because you're good. You're going in because the people who are in the people who are in the land are more evil than you. Oh, wow, right? You're going in because there's somebody worse than you in there, right? You get the land because they're bad. So what were they doing so bad? Well, obviously, we can see some of it manifesting in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? But the principle is that in that process, the eradication of the exploitation, torture, and enslavement of humans was principle upon the idea of service to another God. But there was also the understanding that that was a social injustice. And if you ever want to know the theme of Torah, if you take all of Torah and you examine it, the theme of Torah is social justice. Okay? How to treat another human being. Commandments to take care of the poor that we should not have to hear, but we do hear because we just don't think in our minds that's what we need to do. Commandments to protect the weak. Again, why do we need that commandment? Because we don't, right? Okay. So you understand now what an enemy is. You understand now what hate is. You need to think of hate not in terms of an attack upon the differences of a human being. That's the American definition of hate. The Hebraic definition of hate is something that causes someone to turn away from someone else or from something. Hate is an adversive process. What do I mean by adversive? Well, think of it more like the path of least resistance. Hate is the process of realizing that you may need to alter your path because of the resistance. Okay? That's a very different definition. It causes you to change your direction, it causes your heart to change direction from the person whom you are changing direction from. In other words, hate takes hold as a result of injury. In fact, the word hate itself in the Hebrew means pain, right? Let's go back and let's check that again. So we have this sheen noon aleph here, right? But the truth is that's coming from this here. So the aleph is what actually causes it to become what? The turning away from the person. But what's causing that in the first place? This physical or mental damage. Physical or mental damage. Okay, so hate is not the process of finding a justifiable means by which to exploit, to torture, or enslave an inferior or different people, but instead is the emotional attachment to pain that causes you to turn away from someone. So when it says, I will hate them with a perfect hatred, what he is saying is that he has turned his heart away from the enemies of God. Did Joshua have a hard heart? Remember what I have taught you about how the hardened heart prevents you from hearing Torah. And yet Joshua in chapter 1, verse 8 says, this book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate upon it day and night. And by doing what it says to do, you will have success. That is the concept of the success promise of Torah. The principle that Torah will create success in your life. that's coming from a man who supposedly had a hard enough heart to be able to kill women and children. But you need to remember the purpose behind that and why that was occurring. Now, as we get into the focus of the violence in the Bible, people often take a very distorted view of it based upon what they're reading in the English. But now you see where it says that he would hate the enemies of God. It does not mean that he would find a justification by which to exploit them, torture them, or enslave them, but instead that he would turn away from them. So let's talk a minute about this idea of turning away. The principle is that if an enemy has demonstrated that they now intend to hurt, harm, right, or take, then you are authorized to engage. That's the rules of engagement. In other words, if an opponent comes along and they are just an idiot at the moment, you should not destroy them. But if someone has demonstrated intent to hurt you, your family, take or damage your property, then you need to understand that there is a given permission, as it were. There's a permission in Torah to defend those things. But you do not defend them as if you are the inferior one. You destroy with superiority. Which means what? When it's time to engage, you get in it. You do it. So what's the lesson here? Well, it's interesting because we have Esau who says, when my mourning is done, I will kill Jacob. Yeshua says that if you hate a brother, you've committed murder. The intent to commit murder is hatred, not hatred from the Hebrew word in the way that you would understand it, but hatred in the way that I am talking about in the English language. Because why? Because that's the English definition that's being given there. So when we're dealing with the idea of hatred creating murder, it's a very different hatred than what's in the Hebrew, right? Okay, now, this is the part that's important. When Jacob comes back to the promised land, as he crosses the river Jabbok, he encounters an opponent who he engages fully, okay? And as he engages him fully, he then does what? He has to have a dislocation in order to lose. He prevails until that moment because he's engaging him fully. It is not an enemy, right? It's not an enemy because there is no discussion of intent to harm. Does he get harmed? Yes, it seems as though he did, but there doesn't seem to be a discussion concerning the intent to harm. On the other hand, Esau meets his brother with 400 men. Okay? He sends 400 men to attack Jacob. Now, the reason why this is so important is because now we can see Esau's intent of the heart. But now we look at Malachi, where it says, Jacob I have loved, and Esau I have hated. When Yahweh hates something, he turns away from it because of pain, right? If we accept those definitions. Now, how you hurt the intensification of all power in the universe, I'm not going to get into that today. But we do know that the turning away of Esau was based upon something that was an injury, as it were, to him. And so in principle, Esau then now is hated by God, or what? Is turned away from God. Now we can see the enemy of God becoming relevant here. So was Jacob an enemy of God? Well, it's interesting because let's read one of the 10 commandments. So we're going to go to Exodus, and we're going to go to chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. And I'm going to actually read from verse 5. And it says, "You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, Yahweh, your Elohim, am a jealous Elohim, who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon the children, and the entire family is affected, even the children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me." Let's look at what it says in the Hebrew. Of those who what? Who hate me. So an enemy of God is somebody who is turned away from him. But according to David's definition, if we go back into the Psalm 139 scripture, looking back at 17, "How precious are your thoughts about me, O God? They cannot be numbered. I can't even count them. They outnumber the grains of sand. When I wake up, you are still with me. O God, if only you would destroy the wicked. Get out of my life, you murderers." Okay? They blaspheme you. Your enemies misuse your name. Let's go see how that reads in the Young's literal translation. "Who exchanged thee for wickedness, lifted up to the vanity are thine enemies." Okay? "Do I not hate, Yahweh, those hating you? And with thy withstanders grieve myself." Okay. There is a lot of ways that we could go about this and think about this. What do we know? We know that somebody who is the wicked or the Rasha is somebody who has chosen evil, chosen it, not fell into it, slipped into it, made a mistake, but have embraced it. Okay, they've embraced it. Now, in a minute, we'll get into this, the relevance here, but they've chosen evil, they've embraced it. And so in that process, now they have become enemies of God. And it says, while we were enemies of God, Christ still died for us. So bear with me. But the enemies of God, we are supposed to turn away from. I'm not going to use the H word there because you guys would go nuts with that. We're supposed to turn away from the enemies of God. Who are the enemies of God? According to Yahweh, it's those who have rejected him or who have turned away from him and who have chosen evil over him, okay? And have lifted themselves up in vanity. In other words, they put themselves in a position that they are not qualified, okay? David goes on to say, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if it is a grievous way, if there is a grievous way be in me, and lead me in the way of age enduring." Okay. So this is what David says. He says, it's amazing how you think about me, that you love me. It's amazing that you're connected with me. You're special to me. I wish you would destroy your enemies. I do. I wish you would destroy your enemies. In fact, they're my enemies because they're your enemies. In other words, he's in covenant with him. He aligns himself with the military action that God chooses to have against those who oppose him. But then he says something interesting. He says, however, if I'm an enemy, show me how to not be an enemy. Even in all this judging that David does about the wicked, he asks God to let him know if he's wicked as well. That's an important element when it comes to engaging an opponent. Remember what I said about empathy. Remember I said that if you engage opponent, you have to engage them fully because you don't know what they're capable of. You have to finish the fight. Okay? In my case, obviously, that's a dislocation, that's a breaking, that's a tearing, that's a removal of the weapon or an attacking of the weapon, or a disarming, and of course, immobilization. Make it to where they can't follow you anymore, which means some sort of making them unable to use their legs. Okay. And so in that attacking the weapon and in the disarm and immobilization, you are making a decision at that moment. You're making a judgment at that moment that that person is no longer worthy to have their arm work correctly. So then you need to decide whom to engage and how much to engage. Remember, I said you're fully engaged, but there's an element of understanding the empathy with the person, right? However, if it's an enemy, which means what? Somebody who has declared war on you. You will never yourself identify somebody as an enemy. You won't say that person is my enemy because they have gone wrong with you. It's when they're at the gate and you have to pull the stake out of the ground that they become the enemy. Which means up until that moment, they're not the enemy until they have engaged you. And if they have engaged you, you fully engage them. This is something you need to understand because there are people who are wounded enough that all they want to do is wound. I was one of them. When I hated the world, I just wanted to watch it burn. I just wanted to make everybody's life miserable. And that was because of the loathing I had of myself. The disconnect that I had from my own belief about who I was. But when my identity changed, I fell in love with this world and wanted to become the change that it needed. When that happened, I no longer wanted to watch the world burn, but I promise you, until that moment, I was the enemy, creating intention to destroy. And so from that point of view, what you need to understand is that although people can change, at the moment when a person has set themselves against you and you engage them and you fully engage them, which means that you pull out the stops. You go all in. Short version is that you make sure that they can't attack you anymore, and you make sure that they can not follow you. That's the key. And so you figure out, well, what makes them capable of attacking you? What makes them capable of following you? Well, one of them is the simple one, obviously, is that because a majority of the people in this world do not actually know how to use their hands and feet. They know how to use their mouth. And so obviously mouths speaking against you, every tongue that rises against you shall fall, is the promise to Israel. And if you name the name of Christ, you're Israel. But you need to also understand that that process has to be clear here. What do I mean by that? If somebody accuses you of something and your conscience isn't clear, they win. You need to know your identity. If someone says, oh, you know what, you're nothing but a thief, a swindler, and you know that you did the best you could in the business deal and that maybe it didn't go through the way that you expected and you weren't being shady, but they're accusing you of it, it's easy to say, no, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. But if there's a question about whether or not you did do that, then obviously then the accuser of the brethren can execute the prosecution and request for you to fall under judgment, right? So obviously a clear conscience is key. Being able to walk through life and say, I am at peace with all men according to the best of my ability. That clear conscience will give you the ability to engage an opponent or an enemy. Now, that's obviously the first level, the ability to completely disengage the power of the enemy's mouth, to get character assassination out of your soul. You have to know who you are. You are a high maintenance child of God, not one of the expletives that a person has chosen to call you. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you need to understand that this is very contrary to what a lot of American Christians understand about Scripture. You need to understand there are people who have chosen evil, chosen their wounds. I'll get to that in a minute. Chosen their wounds to what? To deal with life. They will hurt you. And you need to understand that there's a point in time where you just have to turn away from that path and not walk through those thorns and that damage and that pain. I know so many people who endure abuse from their spouses or from their family members, mental, emotional, even physical, because they want to make it work, or they're trying to be a good Christian, or they're trying to be a good wife or a good husband, or they're trying to be a good kid. But the truth is there's a point in time where you need to understand that choosing of evil makes them your enemy. Okay? Okay. So now let's talk about the wicked. Okay? Because I think that's an important element here about engagement. So what we're going to do, we're just going to go ahead and go to the board. Start a new page. And I will remind you guys that actually, you know what, let's do this a different way. Just real quick, we'll do this. We will pull this up here. Okay, and we're looking at that word right there. Rasha, rasha. And it's from the root word to be wicked or act wickedly. And we will go ahead and actually pull this up in the lexicon and see what the ancient pictographic Hebrew has to say about it. But I can tell you right now, it's not a child root. It's an adopted root. So it might not have a really good definition where we can find the pictograph. We'll see. Okay, Rasha, coming from the parent root. Looks like there is no parent root. So we're just going to go with the closest pictographic definition, which is going to be here. Leaving the well-traveled path may result in becoming lost. In the same way, a person who leaves the correct path of life will become lost and wicked. Rasha is to depart, to go astray from the correct path and become lost, to act against a law or teaching as one who has gone astray. And then the hiphil or the causative form means a convict. Okay, and then we have rasha as in lost, departed from the correct path or way out of ignorance or to revolt. Okay. And so you can see it's an adopted root. That's why it has the AR. There isn't actually a parent root there. But what we can do is we can kind of go through and seek out that parent root. Sorry, that one here. There we go, AR right here. All right, so at any rate, so there's a few ways that we can go about this, but the general understanding is that we can seek out the parent root by investigating each individual pictographic letter. And I think it's important enough to understand who the wicked are to do this. So what we're going to do, we'll just start with our word rasha. Okay. So it's going to be one of three parent roots. We're either going to have Resh Shin. So we'll write Resh Shin over here. Okay. Then we could potentially have Resh Ayin. Resh Ayin. Okay. And or we can have Shin Ayin. Okay, those are our three possible roots. We'll go into the ancient Hebrew language and alphabet book to look these up. And then we'll see, we'll write down what the roots are and we'll see which one comes closest and we'll try to make a conclusion with that. Okay, so here we go. First thing we need to do is get into our other book. And we're going to start with Resh Shin. Resh Shin. Should be right around the corner here. So it's Samek Ayin Pei Resh. So, or Tzadi Resh, sorry. Sorry. Tzadi Kof Resh. That's funny. I was thinking in the English alphabet. Okay, Resh Shin is our first one. And that is the Hebrew word head of two or chief. So let's go ahead and write that down on the board real quick. I won't transfer over to the board. I'll just write it down and then we'll go to the next one. So the next one is Resh Ayin. Okay. And that is man watched or companion. Okay. And then we'll go with Shin Ayin and see if we can get something there. I'm thinking that we might be encountering something with the god. We'll see. Shin Ayin. Destroyer watches. Oh, yeah. Duh, that's a given, right? Forgot about that. Okay, so switching over to here, the question is of those three things, which one of these three fits wickedness? Not one of them. Okay, so that means that we potentially need to what? We need to look at something else, which I'll explain real quick here. So in this letter here, we actually have two possibilities of a letter. We have either the I, which is where we get the idea of watching, or we have the twisted rope. Okay. which is where we get the idea of twisting or of manipulating or of wrapping around. We'll have to see how it goes. So let's see if there is, so I can tell you in this book, there is no ga. So we're going to have to go back to the lexicon for this and see what we can find. And what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and I will type in the Hebrew, the actual Hebrew letters. Just going to go resh, ayin, and go looking for our words. So resh, ayin is friend or bad. Oh, wait, that's not where we want to go with that. When we're looking this up, what you got to understand is that the letter ga got assimilated. It's still present in some of the other Middle Eastern languages, but it is not present in the Hebrew. But it means dysfunctional. Okay, dysfunctional. Well, that kind of could go in the direction of that, but we need to also understand this is the Hebrew word for evil or bad. Okay. So we have a candidate, right, for this dysfunction, impaired or abnormal action other than that for which a person or thing is intended, something that does not function within its intended purpose. So we definitely have some option there, but let's check Shin Ayin and see if we have anything there. So we're just going to go Shin Ayin. And you guys know the reason why I do this the way I do this. Obviously, I could go and I could say, okay, this is what it means and this is how it is and blah, blah, blah. I'm showing you how to search these things out because I definitely, obviously, I want you to fact check, but there is so much that can be learned from someone else reading a definition or looking at something, right? There's a man, it's not here. There is a wisdom to be had from allowing that, the humility of allowing another person to take a look at what you're studying and say, oh yeah, here it is. Anyways, it looks like there isn't actually a GA version of this. I can check the GA area really quick because it's at the end here of the lexicon. There's our twisted rope stuff. But what we are looking for, actually, I need to be at the end of the sheen stuff here. So let's go sheen tav, sheen kof. Looking for sheen tav, that's our indicator. That's sheen resh. Oh, that's one of our possibilities, right? Oh, no, nope, it's not. Okay. Sheen tav, here we go. Okay, there's tav. So there is no Shin Ayin. Okay. So there's no Shin Ga. All right. So that being the case, our candidate is the Resh Ayin, right? The word evil, which we've discussed this before, right? It is what? It is the let's see, what is the, let's just do this. So we have our Resh, we have our Ayin, right? And then what we have is another added letter. We'll get to that, right? Okay, but bringing these down into their pictographs, we have the drawing of a human head, right? And we have what? A twisted rope. And actually, let's do that differently. That's more what the pictograph looks like. And this is on ancient pottery. And it means dysfunction in the sense of what we've talked about, right? That it's not doing what it was created to do, right? But it's translated in the English as evil, right? So a Rasha is somebody who has chosen evil, but the pictograph that is missing is the sheen. Now, what's interesting about the sheen is that it actually has the idea of crushing or of the two front teeth, right? Two front teeth. And it means to press or destroy, as in to crush, right? And so now we can see where there is a pressing towards destruction. But what I want you to think about is how the sheen ends up in between, okay? Remember what I've talked to you about the idea of the precedence of the right hand honor, right? So the letter that is in the most right hand position augments this. And so it's what? Head presses, right? Head presses to twistedness. Head presses towards the twisted rope. So now we can see that Arasha has decided to what? To press towards dysfunction. But what was a twisted head? What was it? It was wounds, right? It was limiting beliefs. An entitlement. Which was the result of what? A result of abuse, neglect, of needs not being met. Wounds occur. Let me explain to you wounds. Remember, we're talking about a distorting or a twisting of the head. Wounds occur when there has been some sort of interruption in the function of human process. What's human process? Self-preservation, connection, and reproduction. If somehow those get tweaked, so let's talk about connection. What's connection? That's the herd, right? That's that instinct to be in a group or to be the group, okay? It's either a desire to be in a group or a desire to be a group, to have people be in. That doesn't necessarily equate to a leader or a follower, but then instead in how a person thinks about how they're located in the group, okay? Self-preservation, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about the arrogancy of selfishness, right? What you have, I want. What's yours is mine, right? Or are we talking more about self-preservation as in love your neighbor as yourself? You have to love yourself first before you can love your neighbor. There has to be a love for you. There has to be a preservation of you. So how does that preservation work? Obviously in your defense, pulling the stake out of the ground and sticking it in the enemy who has come to destroy your tent, right? But having the ability and belief that you're the clan leader and that you have the right to defend yourself. The people who sit there and let themselves be walked on partially don't have that understanding, and they could be a father. The principle is that you obviously need to step into a role in which you become the destroyer. And as the destroyer, what you are removing is the enemy. Remember, an enemy is anybody who gets close enough to that stake to be stuck because you had to pull it out in the first place. Remember, there's a difference between an enemy and an opponent. An opponent is somebody who has not chosen wickedness, right? An opponent can still be dysfunctional from their wounds, their limiting beliefs, and their entitlements, and the lack of imagination, but also they have not chosen to stay in it. The damaged ones, the ones who have chosen to stay in it, the ones who have chosen to continue to be dysfunctional, those ones are a threat. So you need to deviate from the path. If they're standing in your path, you don't try to go through them. You go around the thorn bushes, right? That's the definition of hate, to go away from somebody. Something that causes you to go away from somebody. Now, here's the part that's important. Even in engagement, you need to accept the responsibility of healing. What do I mean by that? If after I have disabled an opponent and removed their ability to either have or be a weapon and remove their ability to follow me, if they ask for mercy, if they ask for help, I have to bind their wounds. I have to reset their joints. That's part of my art. In fact, we're told that. But the principle is that now they understand they're not allowed to touch you. They're not allowed to engage you. They're not allowed to come at your family or your property or you or your children. You are to engage them. Why is this so important? Because Yahweh put in Torah the story of Jacob and Esau, Jacob wrestling an opponent versus Jacob approaching and seeking mercy from Esau, and Esau meeting him with 400 men, as an understanding of the difference between an opponent and an enemy. And the understanding the difference between engagement and turning away. Because what does Jacob do? He never comes to Seir. He turns away and goes to Sukkot. Instead of going with Esau, the enemy, to Mount Seir and joining Esau there, he turns away and goes to Sukkot. And we can see to this day an engagement of enemies to Jacob from Esau. That's obviously another study and a different story. Now, the reason why all of this is so important is because you need to get your mind wrapped around hate, your mind wrapped around enemies. Because when Yeshua says something about enemies versus what Torah says something about enemies versus what David says about enemies, you need to understand what those things are. This portion, this Torah portion, teaches you what an enemy versus an opponent is. Doesn't mean you're going to win or lose. It's how you're being engaged. The principle that in order for Jacob to enter back into the promised land, that he had to create a contingency by which the children of the concubines and the concubines went first, and then the children of the wives went next, was an understanding that if they were engaged, that the group could escape. His firstborns could escape. So, once you're engaged, you're fully engaged. Doesn't matter whether it's an opponent or an enemy. The level of mercy that you show in that engagement is going to come in an understanding of someone who has chosen to continue to be dysfunctional or who is just making a mistake. There is a necessity to engage the enemy in order to protect your family. Now, the question is what does that mean for you, since you are your worst enemy? The final part of this is simple. You need to be brutally honest in your engagement of yourself. Because in order to become the change this world needs, obviously we need mastery, right? That's a given. Self-mastery. We need to overcome the adversities in our lives. We need to overcome the wounds, overcome the limiting beliefs, and become practitioners of that overcoming. As we become practitioners, if we do it a lot of times, over time, we become a master. If we're a master, then we're a teacher, which means somebody in this world will benefit from your pain, from your sufferings and your overcomings, and not have to go through them, because they will learn from you. You will teach them how to not have to go through these things. You have no idea how much I'm actually encountering in that in my life right now, how much I'm actually encountering the knowledge that I gained to help me become who I've become today. I am now giving to someone else. And in that process now, the things that I went through, they don't have to go through without understanding. They may still have to go through the adversity, but they'll have an understanding of how to get through it. That's the key. So as you engage yourself and become the change that this world needs, you need to be brutal about it. You need to be fearless about it. That's the key. And that's the point, is understanding the difference between an enemy and an opponent. Understanding that there is a need to engage both, but one of them you are to destroy. And you need to understand that that destruction is for the sake of those who need protection. This is not a time for you to start getting caught up in whether or not you are being mean or whether or not you are overdoing it. You need to be the Yeshua in the situation. Remember, the word Yeshua, the name Yeshua, means destroyer watches. In fact, we just saw that definition a minute ago. You just saw the definition again for Yeshua, which I thought was rather coincidental. I didn't even think about it when I was writing it up on the board. So for those of you on YouTube, the last thing that I would say before I say Shabbat Shalom is 90% of the people that you're going to encounter are opponents. You need to remember that they have the same anatomy, same pain, same emotional attachments, same coping mechanisms that you do. Your choice to engage them has to be based on an understanding of danger, not fear. Remember, fear is an imagination about what might happen and reacting to it now, instead of just meeting things as they come. Whereas danger is reacting to the potential of harm to you. An enemy, on the other hand, who has already declared war on you, you are to destroy. Do not get it twisted because you think you understand what you're reading in Matthew when Yeshua says that you are not supposed to hate your brother, when Yeshua says to love your enemy. You can love your enemy and still disable him. Okay? It is possible. And it is possible to sleep at night with shalom when you are commanded to disengage yourself from the enemies of God. You need to understand that a Rasha will hurt you. A Rasha has chosen their wounds over healing, and so they will wound. There's a lot that goes into this, right? And obviously, maybe this will come up in the Midrash and discussions like, what about family members? What about husbands or wives? Or what about, coworkers or things like that? Like, God guides you. But again, if someone has declared war on you, you win. There's no reason that you are not allowed to win. Okay? You are not to be walked on. You're not a rug, not a carpet. Okay? All right. So I will say Shabbat Shalom to those who are on YouTube.